Did you grow up with a certain understanding of yourself and your place in the world, perhaps taking it for granted, and at one point realize, wait, how have I accepted this? Or how did I not see this? I can imagine that all of us have some story like this, whether it's about our identities or the dreams we have for our life or the expectations that have guided our path. The stories we learn from our family, our church, and our society shape us in powerful ways, but they need not determine our destiny. The stories we are taught are not always the stories that we were meant to live out. Fortunately, we have the power to rewrite them. As we near the end of our theme year on the stories of our lives, today we begin the sermon series on the stories that we have learned, which we come to realize do not reflect what we know to be true and right. We then have the difficult task of unlearning them, of removing their narrative from our body, mind, and spirit, and writing a new story going forward about ourselves and about how the world works. When I was growing up, I assumed that I was heterosexual. And as far as I know, so did everyone around me. We live in a heteronormative society where heterosexuality is the assumed orientation, so I didn't think much of it. It's not that I wasn't aware of other sexual orientations or that I didn't know people who were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or who embodied diverse gender expressions. I grew up in a Unitarian Universalist church where LGBTQ people were in leadership and teaching Sunday school. As an 8th grader, I took About Your Sexuality, the precursor to the Our Whole Lives sexuality education class that we now offer. And one of the teachers was a gay man who had been an early pioneer in bringing together the LGBT community in my hometown of Albany, New York. But that's how heteronormativity works. Even though I was surrounded by diverse role models for how I could be in the world, and I was not taught that different types of bodies and sexual orientations were wrong or deserving of shame, the story that I might not be heterosexual was not part of my awareness. I went to a girls' school from pre-K through 12th grade, whose motto was, "From here, girls can go anywhere." The message I learned was that girls can be anything. I'm sure they meant doctors, lawyers, elected officials, chefs, scientists, artists, clergy, and more. But I hadn't quite internalized those expansive possibilities when it came to my identity. It was only when I pulled up my roots and left home and moved to an entirely different context that the blinders started coming off. When I came out to my parents, it was clear that this wasn't the story that they had written in their heads for me and how it was meant to go. But they quite quickly rewrote that story and were nothing but loving and accepting. But it required some significant reframing for them. Some of their original story has come to fruition. I'm married, and when my twins were born, they became grandparents. But the genre and the characters of the story changed. Each of us, as we grow up, develops a story or stories about our body and our sexuality. It's a story about who we are and how we should feel about that. When our church offers the Our Whole Lives sexuality education program for children, at each level there is a required parent orientation. One of the things we ask the parents to reflect on at the orientations is what messages they received as children about their own body, touch and affection, gender roles, intimate relationships, sexual attraction, pleasure, and responsibility. You can imagine that this brings up a lot. Then we invite them to think about the messages that they want to pass on to their child that will promote their sexual health and self-esteem. The stories that we teach our young people about their bodies and sexuality are important and can have a lifelong impact. I mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton in a sermon a few months back. She's one of our Unitarian foremothers and was a prominent leader in the movement for women's suffrage. As I was reading about her, I came across a horrifying bit of information about her early life. As a child, her father diminished her time and time again, telling her that he wished she had been born a boy. In a letter when she was an adult to Susan B. Anthony, she wrote about her entrance into heaven, and she said this: "When good Peter asks me where I would sit, I shall say, anywhere, so that I am neither a Negro nor a woman. Confer on me, good angel, the glory of white manhood, so that henceforth, sitting or standing, rising up or lying down, I may enjoy the most unlimited freedom." Elizabeth Cady Stanton was steeped in racism and patriarchy. And her life is an example of how the stories we learn as children are powerful, sometimes painfully so, shaping how we think about our worthiness and humanity and the worthiness and humanity of others. Where do these harmful stories about bodies and sexuality come from? They don't originate with the parents. In many cases, sadly, they come from religion and the most foundational stories of religious traditions around the world. Perhaps the most ubiquitous of these scriptural stories is the creation story involving Adam and Eve. Adam is created in God's perfect image, and Eve is created as a companion. Eve gives in to the temptation of the serpent and eats the apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge, and they are banished from the Garden of Eden. Prior to the apple eating, Adam and Eve live innocently, not thinking much of the fact that they are naked. But after eating the forbidden fruit, they become aware that they are naked and are ashamed. And so they sew together fig leaves to cover themselves. All of a sudden, their bodies become something to be hidden. Many religious traditions, including Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism, place restrictions around how and where women can participate while menstruating, informed by theologies that label women as unclean or impure. In Buddhism, there are stories of women who, in order to go beyond the potential for enlightenment or Buddhahood, must become male-bodied rather than female-bodied. On the surface, these stories convey a radical message about the fluidity of gender, but in practice, these stories end up reinforcing the gender binary and the inferiority of women's bodies. Unitarian Universalists are not immune to this either. Even William Ellery Channing, who helped us claim the name Unitarian and who preached about humanity's likeness to God, did not fully internalize his own message. For Channing, our likeness to God resides in our mind and in our capacity to reason. He didn't seem to understand this likeness as extending below the neck, even to the heart. In fact, as we know from his letters and journals, Channing was quite ashamed of his own body. He was a rather short man, sickly, with a voice that his Unitarian contemporary Elizabeth Palmer Peabody described as soft and angelic. He loathed his self-described effeminacy and what he called his inappropriate urges. As a young man, in an effort to toughen himself, he slept on the bare, hard floor, walked outside in the cold at every hour of the day and night, experimented with his diet, and did not exercise. These practices did not strengthen and toughen him. Quite the opposite. He ended up harming his body, which he had to live with until he died at age 62. Imagine if Channing's theology of his likeness to God had extended to his whole being. How differently he would have viewed himself and others, and how much less shame he would have lived with. Our reading this morning was written by the Reverend Cynthia Fredo, and it offers a much more expansive understanding of our likeness to God and what it means to be made in the image of the holy. This likeness includes humanity in all of its diversity. I, who am all of these things and more, want to know, who am I that I am made in your image, she asks. And the response is, I am in you and you are in me. Forgive me, responds Fredo. I forgot that you are everywhere. I forgot that I am everywhere. Thank you for reminding me of who I am. Who she is and who we are is whole and holy. Humanity's psalm is a song or a story of someone relearning the story of their life, in what image they were made, embracing the fullness of it, and taking their place in the universe. Our Unitarian Universalist message about bodies and sexuality, when preached and practiced at its best, is one that affirms the goodness of our bodies and of diverse expressions of sexuality, and promotes healthy and responsible relationships with ourselves and others. One of the most important ways that we teach this story is through the Our Whole Lives program, which our church offers every year to 1st, 6th, and 8th graders, and every few years for adults of all ages. This program has been helping people rewrite the story of their lives as sexual beings for decades. And it helps our littlest ones write healthy and empowering stories from the very beginning. My colleague, the Reverend Sadie Lansdale, when asked about what she's most grateful for when it comes to being raised Unitarian Universalist, talked about the OWL program. She said, OWL can't protect you from being hurt, but it can protect you from buying the lie that it was your fault. What a powerful, formative, and life-saving resource this is. It's important that we teach these messages, not only because it impacts how we view ourselves, but it impacts how we treat others as well. There is no script. Others may have a script for you, and many of us spend our lives following societal norms that form a script of sorts. But what I've learned is that life takes unexpected and unscripted twists and turns. And each of us continues to discover new truths about ourselves and about the world, no matter how old we are. Our stories must evolve along with these twists, turns, and discoveries. Our stories must be flexible enough to be rewritten when necessary. What would the world look like if we lived as if all people were made in the image of God? A God that is the source of transformative love, a God that is hope and possibility, a God that is the source of all being and forms us from the elements mixed with energy, passion, and dreams. I believe that it would look quite a bit different from the world we live in today. It's not here yet, but it is possible. Each of us has a part in creating such a world. One thing you can do is to help young people to develop these positive, affirming stories from the start. You can do this by teaching in our Sunday school, but our volunteer teachers are not the only ones teaching young people in our church. All of us tell these stories through our words and our actions. And I invite you to examine the stories that you have learned about your body and your sexuality, because the story that you are living impacts not only you, but others around you. What did you learn about the value of different genders or sexual orientations, or about bodies of various shapes and sizes, abilities, and ages? Hopefully, many of these stories are positive. But if there are stories that you have learned that are causing harm to you or others, this church can be a space for you to reflect on those, to engage in practices of unlearning them, and to rewrite your story anew. Creator of all life, source of all being, it was from the particles of the universe that you formed us. Iron and carbon and phosphorus, mixed with energy, passion, and dreams. Thank you for reminding us of who we are. Let this be our prayer. Amen.